the recording on. Okay, so today, because each week we're going to be constructing different pieces. So today, this is kind of a long, there's going to be like one long lesson that fills the entire class. This is going to be building the collar. So I guess before we get going, are there any questions or comments or anything anyone needs of me? Yes, Vicky.
Okay, I'm still in what I call muslin hell.
Okay.
And I think I have the body okay, but the sleeve is still too wide.
Okay.
So I just want your suggestion on how can should I do I've seen on the like YouTube bicep decrease thing where you slash this way and slash this way. Should I?
Well, you have,
well, I mean, the seam is that way,
yeah,
but
so you would just take it in at the seam
on the outside.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But this seam should remain parallel to the grain line.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
No.
Do I change the grain line once I do? Or
the grain line, as a rule, is perpendicular to the cuff.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, yeah, see, that's the beauty of having a seam down. It's called a top seam on a raglan. That's a beauty of having that, so that you can, if you need to add more bicep, you can add more bicep. If you need to reduce the bicep, you can reduce the bicep. You don't have to go through all of those heroic.
I know when they slash this, they add they're adding width here, which I just see.
I'm very selective about who I listen to. I tend not to go to YouTube if I want to learn anything. And
I'm desperate.
this is no diss, but my experience has been that there are people out there who are giving you a very complicated solution because they want to make it look like they really know something. And see, my guiding principle in all of this is, if common sense says, why don't you just take it up at the seam? Common sense 99.9% of the time is the way to go.
Okay, great. I have been taking it from here, and I just need to take more. I've taken a little from here, like a quarter of an inch on each seam. But the main thing I want to do is right
where you want to get rid of that. Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
Maybe I can find my way out.
Yeah, and so really, and we all know this about common sense solutions are generally but you see, and there is information out there, and this is where YouTube can be a great resource, but again, it can kind of lead you astray. And so I tend to, for me, it's a very short list of people I ask if I need to know something. So if you want to know that list, if it's couture, it's Susan Caldew. Right. She trained in a couture house. She's the one. If it's knits or slinky fabrics or any of that sort of thing, Linda Maynard. Judy Newcomb from Threads she's like an encyclopedia of knowledge. I love Sandra Betsina because I just love Sandra Betsina, and everyone else I will listen to. But when I'm, for as far as like reliable information, those are the ones that I really look at. Everyone else, I will hear what they have to say, but I will evaluate it against like, okay, from a common sense standpoint, does this make sense?
Yes. Okay. So now I don't feel so bad about questioning what they're doing because, okay.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So other questions, other comments,
I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wasn't originally going to do bound buttonholes because my fabric is a little thick, but then I had the idea, could I do the buttonhole part with like a lighter crepe in a color that goes with it?
Absolutely, you can.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
And then if we're doing that for now, at this step, we just do the front of the buttonholes. We don't worry about the placket yet. Is that right?
Right. Okay. So you set the buttonholes themselves in the fronts, and then to finish the backs of the buttonholes. This is after you have your facings on. And I actually finish the backs of the buttonholes before I put the lining in. So you can have the facings in, make sure everything, lines up, and then you can go back in and finish the backs of the buttonholes onto the facing. Then it's an easy step there to go to put in the lining. Okay. Okay. So other questions.
I have one.
Yes, go ahead.
Um, Pressing. I'm a pressing nut.
Oh, yes.
And so because you have the stitch, the hand stitching line, the on the outside.
Yes.
Does that mean that we want to press that seam open, or do we press it to one side? Or do we favor one side, like the Raglan part?
When we get to
even the back.
Yeah, well, when we get to installing the sleeves, I'll talk about that, but I tend to press both seam allowances to one side.
Yeah, that was my.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so other questions? Okay, so, oh yes, go ahead. KJ.
Just if we have time, it would be great to cover off the intersecting seams that you talked about last week, but perhaps at the end of the video, once you've covered everything else off.
Okay. So that, let's see, either if we don't get it this week, maybe we could do it next, because see, next week we're going to be taking cuff latch and doing the top stitching, and that would be a good time to kind of slot that in. So remind me, because I have it on my computer. It's very easy to call up, because this is I may have talked about this, because I had a first in my teaching at FIT. I had students call me a genius, which was like, yeah, I was very surprised by that. And this week, this is just a little kind of a little aside before we get into the lesson for today. Because see, what I tell these kids every week, I say two things. One is the only way you can learn about clothing is by looking at clothing, not pictures of clothing, not the internet. When you have a garment in your hands, you look at it, you turn it inside out, you see, how deep is that hem? How did they finish that seam? The other thing I tell them is, if you know your craft, you will always have work. And so one example I told them this week was, Susan and I we did a sit and sew in Baltimore a while back, and we had a gal who sewed professionally. And I, of course, was curious. Okay, so what do you make? And she said, I sew for the CIA. I'm like, do tell. She said, I can't tell you what I do. That's all I can tell you.
Well, she'd have to kill you.
Yeah. And so I said, okay, so now how did you arrive? How did you get there? And she said that she saw an ad, and it was, they needed someone who knew how to sew, who could pass a security clearance. Okay. And so kind of fast forward to, it was not this, I think it was, yeah, it was this Wednesday. I was electronically introduced to these guys who, because there's this whole thing, you probably have read about it, is they're studying the structure of textiles for the next generations of computer boards and so forth. Mm-hmm. And these guys are kind of in that world. And what they're doing, as best I could gather from because they were very, very vague about all of this, was that they want to make clothes that are surveillance, but look like clothes. And they said, we're engineers, we're not designers. And so we were chatting, and I said, well, if you go on my website, you look, because part of what intrigues me is answering a question. Like some of the things I do, my teacher used to call seam scars. And so you don't want a scar on your face, you should not have a scar on your garment. And so, for me, the thing is to make something that is apparently seamless. And so it starts with the question. And one of the guys said, that is what we're looking for. And I said, okay. And I said, part of, if you're going to be making a garment, it has to function as a garment. Like, for example, for women's pockets, I always make sure that the opening may be bust level, but the contents have to settle below, closer to the waist. Otherwise, you're going to create a strange lump. But that, this is all part of, making a garment function. And they said, women's clothes, we never thought of that. Like, they're 50% of the population, guys. And so, I mean, it was 15 minutes and kind of whizzed through. And then they're like, we'll be getting back with you. And it was, and he's like, I guess this is something for the government. And he said, and you will be compensated. I'm like, I told my students this. And what was kind of fun was you could see that the horizon broadened for them. And also you could see that, because I said, so kids, I may be making James Bond clothes, and it may be that this is the only thing you're ever going to hear of it. But if you know your craft, you will always have work. And these kids were looking at me like, wow. So yeah, yay. Okay, so other questions before we start the lesson? Okay, then. So the lesson, we're going to be making the collar. And as usual, you know, as always, I'm going to collapse down the video visual of you all. And so if you have questions, you know, stop me, make sure, because this is, as you can see here, 52 minutes, it's going to be a heavy lift. So at any point you need to stop me, please don't be shy. So let's go. The collar. This is what we're going to be creating in this next lesson. And you all can hear that, correct?
Yes.
Okay, beautiful. So the collar has a little bit of structure. It's not as structured as, say, full-on tailored collar, but it's fun to make. Now we have a lot to do, so let's get busy. Here you see the undercollar pattern piece with the face fabric. We also have cut this out of muslin and the tailoring canvas. Now I've worked ahead and I've drawn the stitching lines on one of the sides, but you want to draw the stitching lines on the tailoring canvas because this is going to be a stitching guide for our next step. So again, seam allowances are 1/2 inch, so that you measure in a 1/2 inch. And there we have that. So we are prepared for.
Did you cut the tailoring canvas on the bias also? Yes,
The canvas, the muslin, and the fabric are all cut on the same bias grain.
Thanks.
This is what I call framing the canvas. What we're doing here is we're replacing the seam allowances of the canvas with something much thinner, so that when you install this into a garment section, you don't have to worry about pressing, because the stitching line will be right about there. The muslin is far more flexible and easier to sew and easier to press. So let me show you how we make that. I worked ahead and pinned one of the canvas pieces to the muslin. And so here, again, I want to line up the cut edges. And now we have both pieces pinned off to the sewing machine. We can use either a zigzag or a serpentine stitch. I'm using the serpentine stitch. The stitch width is 5.0. The stitch length is 2.0. What you want to do is you want the zigzag to be just ever so slightly inside the pencil line. If you're wondering, err on the side of a little too far in rather than too far out, because we're going to cut away the canvas right on the pencil line. So, and then the cut edge will be our stitching guide for later.
Kenneth, can I ask a quick question?
Go ahead.
Is there a preference between, you said either zigzag or serpentine. If you have the choice, do you prefer the serpentine for a reason, or?
I like it because it's a little more secure. Because if you're trimming the canvas and you nick a stitch, it's not quite so crucial. But if you don't have the serpentine, just the plain old zigzag will work just fine.
Okay, thank you.
be pretty, you can use any old thread because this will be inside the garment. We have one finished, so I'll let you see what it looks like. There it is. And yes, we're being watched, just so you know. So I will go off camera, sew the other one, and then I'll meet you back at the work table. So here we are. We have both sides of the collar stitched. The next step is to trim. You want to trim close to or just slightly inside that pencil line. Now notice, this is a little trimming tip. Notice how as I'm going along, I have the cut edges facing my palm. Now, the natural tendency for a lot of people is to come at it this way. The drawback is, first off, you're cutting what's underneath. Also, you can't get so close. So how I like to think about it in my mind is like sliding the letter opener right along those zigzag stitches. Because this cut edge is going to be your stitching guide later. So you want it to be as accurate as possible. So this is step one. Step two, we want to trim out the excess muslin. On the inside, you don't want to have this hanging out inside your garment. It doesn't do any good. Because really what this muslin is doing is, like I said, we're creating a frame. If I trim this away, I will explain why we're doing it. Okay, here we are. So let me explain. This side will go against the back of the face fabric. This will be inside. So when you stitch, you're going to stitch right outside the cut edge. So what will get caught in the seam is the muslin, not the canvas. Catch canvas in a seam, it makes it impossible to press flat. You have to get a hammer and tongs to flatten it. So this is one. I will go off camera and trim the other one. Okay, here we are. We have both pieces. Our next step will be applying them to the face fabric. This is where we apply the canvas. So Vicki, I see you raised your hand.
Yes. I'm unmuted. All right. So before I've seen this technique, what I used to do, and I wanted your opinion on it, is that I would cut the canvas smaller and I would like cross stitch it in so that I would see, and so
that's a like an old school tailoring method. That is way too much work. Seriously. I mean, that is a legitimate technique. I've done it myself, and this is much quicker. And
yes, it is.
I think much more secure.
Okay. All right. I used to do before I saw your technique there. That's what I used to do.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
All right. Thanks.
One other question, as long as we're stopped, Ken.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Is this, I've seen this in print before. Is this in your Cool Couture book?
This is in Cool Couture. It's also in the Tailored Jacket PDF book.
Okay. thank
Also,
you.
it's in the threads. There's this excellent series called Smart Tailoring with Kenneth D. King, Taunton Press. It's in there as well. I refer to it as new school tailoring. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's and it probably is an article in threads at one point. So yes, it's been in print several times.
Thank
Okay,
you.
so other questions? Okay, so moving right along to the back of the face fabric. Now, a little explanation here. This is the side that we want to go against the back of the fabric. The reason for this is that when we're sewing, the stitch will sit right about there. And if there's any read through that might occur, the muslin acts as a buffer. If we actually were putting it this way, say if you have the canvas closer to the back of the fabric, what would happen, especially if it's a thinner fabric, you might get a read through of this crease when you're pressing, and it would show on this side, and then you would really regret it. So this is the thing to remember. Back of the fabric, muslin, canvas on the back. So knowing that, we're going to pin this together and tailor baste. For those who don't like to baste, there are times I try to get away without basting, but that's ready to wear. That is not what we're doing here. We want something better. So this is what it's going to look like. This is called a tailor baste. The tailor baste, generally you don't put a knot in your thread because you don't want to have to worry about it creating bumps. Stitch a couple of times to anchor. So the stitch runs perpendicular to the line of travel. You don't have to pull it tight. You just want it to hold the two layers together. The beauty of this particular stitch is somewhat like a pad stitch. Actually, it's a bigger pad stitch. It will stretch a little bit if you need it to. When you get to the other end, here your thread. Voila. So here, we are now ready to pin the two center back seams together. And I want that point there to match that corner there. So we're matching up those corners, and same at this end. There we are. Those two corners match. And then we pin baste because we want to sew just outside those cut edges. So we're pinned. Now let's go over to the machine and sew. Now you can see I have put on my zipper foot. This is just a little precaution I like to take because you have fewer thicknesses here, more thicknesses here. So having the zipper foot on makes it so that these thicknesses don't really create a drag on the seam as you're sewing. Standard 2.5 stitch. Notice you're stitching just outside that edge. Okay, so let's show you the result. See, the stitch is just outside that edge there, and here as well. So now I'll take this over to the pressing table, give it a press. I'll meet you at the pressing table. So we press this zone. And here, this is where I like to get out my seam roll. And press this over the seam roll. Back to the work table. To control the seam allowances, I like to just sew. Vicki, question.
Okay, I saw that you did not trim back the muslin.
No, not necessary.
Not necessary? It's not enough thickness, you're saying?
Not really.
All
I mean,
right.
you could if you wanted to, but you know, not absolutely necessary.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so other questions?
Kenneth, just one about your choice of foot there with the zipper foot.
Yeah.
What do you think about zipper foot versus walking foot in these sorts of scenarios?
Well, you could use the walking foot. You know, for me, because I have a Bernina, the zipper foot's a little easier to snap on and off. Walking foot, you have to kind of arrange, you know, you kind of have to get the little mechanism to engage with the needle bar. So either or, you know, the object is you don't want the thicknesses to shift as you're sewing.
I have the Bernina too. I was kind of hoping you were going to show me some great trick for sticking on that walking foot, which I've never managed to discover.
Well, you know, it is, you know, time is money. And I just learned, you know, in this particular instance, like slapping on that zipper foot is actually quicker.
Thank you.
Okay. So other questions? Okay.
Yes, I do. So
ahead.
you're tail attacking this one?
Well, this is just a catch stitch.
Oh, so you catch stitching it to the canvas?
Just the canvas, yeah, because I
Alright.
want that to lie flat. I don't want it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay. So moving right along, a little bit of a catch stitch. So you're catching the seam allowance just to the canvas, and you can see I'm using a bright orange thread. You can use any color you want because it's going to be inside the garment. It'll be your little secret. Now this is what I call my catch stitch. I'm not using the absolutely dead correct 100% classic catch stitch because honestly, this is inside the garment and this is quicker. So as you can see, this stitch it's 45 degrees to the line of travel, and you take 2 bites at once. So like I said, it's not dead correct couture, but it works nonetheless. So now let me secure the thread. Okay. And one thing I like to do here is to come in and trim down the seam allowances to about 1/8 of an inch. So that when we come across here or here, you don't have a ginormous bunch getting caught in that seam when you're stitching. This is just preemptive bulk reduction. I think we can make that as a term, preemptive bulk reduction. Okay, there's our center back seam. Step. Now this is where you'll be glad you did your tailor basting on the lower part of your collar. We're going to be shaping it over the ham. So what you want to do, I like to anchor center back with a pin. And then bring it around so that the 2 fronts match. Now, I'll show you what I'm up to here. Okay, so this is the back, and we want the two roughly to meet at the center front. And from here, we're going to build the turn of cloth in. So here, as you can see, you want to have that cut edge of the neck seam is going to be a little higher than this. This is going to overlap it a little. And so now what you're going to see here is you're going to see the turn of cloth. The face fabric is going to hang out from the edge. That's what you want. From here, I'm going to give it.
Is this a special ham, Kenneth?
Excuse me?
Is this a special ham?
No, this is, it's an old one, yeah. But this works on any ham.
Okay.
We had a conversation, I want to say it was on last Thursday, about pressing hams. And the new ones that I'm seeing these days are not quite as good as the old ones. So what I'm glad I bought a couple or three, way back in the day. And to have some at FIT that were, that had some punch to them, I found that going on eBay and looking at old sewing tools, you can get some of these hams.
Kenneth, how big is that overlap at the back of the neck? I couldn't quite see from the video.
If you set it on its base and stood it up, it's roughly 12 to 14 inches high. And it's shaped kind of like a teardrop. It's very strange.
Oh, sorry. On the back of the collar, you showed.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Because see what you
overlap that one.
Yeah. So when you're folding it before you steam, you want the cut edge of the back of the collar to overhang the cut edge of the seam allowance that sews to the neck by about a ½ inch.
Thank you.
Okay. So other questions? Okay. And now we're going to let the turn of cloth, we're going to let that occur. We can trim that off later. From here, I have more basting thread prepared, and then we're going to tailor baste the outer edge of this collar. Now, notice I have my hand underneath. You don't want to risk basting the two layers together or basting the collar to the ham, which I have done, and it's deeply embarrassing when that happens. So these basting stitches obviously will come out later. So I will work around to the other side and bring you back the result. So here we have the tailor basting, which makes this all now ready for the next step, which is the pad stitching. So here you have the collar shaped, and if you lay it out flat, what you can see is that it really doesn't want to lay flat anymore because you've actually built some turn of cloth into it. So the pad stitching, the first row of pad stitching, I'm going to pad stitch kind of on the top of this fold. And then the pad stitching will be a little more dense in what's called the stand of the collar, and it will be a little more sparse on the fall or the flap. So what that's going to look like, for those who've never done pad stitching before, the object here, it's like a very tiny tailor baste, and the object is just to barely catch the fabric underneath. If you get it right on a textured fabric like this, you just won't see it. So you anchor your thread. And it's just a little tiny.
Are you just using Gutermann there?
Yeah, just a regular polyester. The needle. And I like to iron the thread before I sew with it. It makes it travel through the fabric much more smoothly.
So you put it on the needle and then iron it? I've never done that.
I actually I cut it off the spool and then I iron it and then I put it through the needle.
Okay, I'll try it.
So you just kind of set it on the pressing table and drag it underneath. Or I actually learned this from a student, since I don't use hair products or hair tools. I didn't have one of these, but for the ladies, if you've used a flat iron to, if you have long hair and you want it nice and smooth, flat iron does that. And this friend of mine showed me that he uses a flat iron just to iron his thread. So he doesn't have to heat up the iron while he's hand sewing. So that's another option. These to the line of travel. The stitches are, I'd say, about 3/8 of an inch apart. You don't have to pull it too tightly. You just want to marry these, the interfacing and the body fabric together. Now, one thing to know about is, you notice I'm using single strand, and I iron the thread. Debates rage over whether you wax your thread or not. I don't wax the thread because this is polyester thread, and wax doesn't have anywhere to go if you iron it. If you're using a cotton thread, yes, absolutely, you would wax it because that lubricates the thread and it also preserves it. But for polyester, I iron, and that makes it so it sews without any trouble. Now I will go all the way around and finish and bring back the result.
When would you use cotton thread besides quilting?
I just don't use cotton thread. See, years ago, I had a conversation with a museum curator, and she said that work like mine tended to be in someone's collection for 25 to 30 years. And so she said that, that I have work in museum collections, I'm kind of ahead of the game. And so I build for a 25 to 30 year useful life. Cotton thread, unless the garment is stored in archival conditions, cotton thread gets weak over time. Polyester is forever. So I just use polyester. Okay. We are at the end. And obviously, because this is such a high texture, you don't see the stitches in this fabric. Now, one way to gauge a stitch to see that you've picked enough fabric but not too much, as you can see here, my finger is starting to get chewed up. I do this by feel. If the needle, I know how much, if the needle will scrape just on my fingertip, I know that I've gotten enough. So you can see here. So I have sewn to here. Next, I'm going to fill in the stand. Now the second row of stitches, I like to take the bite midway between these two. Just a personal preference. You don't have to, you can have them line up. I just find it controls it better. And when hand sewing, like I said, I iron the thread, and also you don't want the thread much longer than the distance from your hand to your elbow, because what you run into then is you're wrangling too much thread and you waste time with the thread that you wrangle. Some people think that by threading a needle with like 2 yards of thread in it, they're saving time. They're actually not. It gets caught on everything. It tangles. It's just a mess. So if you don't have that as part of your hand sewing habits, get into it. So now I'm just going to turn around and come back the other way, because that's really what we're going to be doing. So again, third row, we just turn around and come back the opposite way. And so what's going to happen is the stitches are going to angle towards each other. That's how they get that, is just going up one row and down the other. Now, one thing I have seen, this is what I hate about single thread, it comes undone. So what I have seen people do is use a blind hem machine for pad stitching. Now I've tried it. I find it's just much easier for me just to hand sew it. It's quicker too and more satisfying. It's very meditative. So I'm gonna go down to this end, and then I will go off camera and finish filling in one side, because this is like watching paint dry if you're not doing it yourself. Okay, so secure the thread here. So you can see the stitches kind of point towards each other. That is as it should be. I will go off camera and fill in the rest of this here and bring it back. So here is one half of the collar. You can see also I have removed the tailor basting because it has served its purpose. Now,
yes, Vicky.
I will work.
Vicky, question. Vicky, did you have a question? Hello, Vicky.
No, I'm sorry. I forgot to lower my hand.
Oh, okay. Not to worry. Okay.
And pad stitch the other side of the collar, because once we have this filled, we want to deal with the flap. I will be back with the results. We're almost done. Now, just find this out, give you a long view. Have the stand pad stitched. Now we want to pad stitch the flap. That is not so dense. We're going to run the stitching lines, I'd say about 3/8 of an inch apart, but then I'm going to show you a little trick for the corners. I have the first row past the roll, about 3/8 of an inch away. Now, this is where I'm going to show you a little trick here. Take some of this basting loose. Just put a pin there for now. So this is a square. This is just muslin. It can be cut on the bias or it can be cut on the straight grain. It is about 2.5 inches deep. And what we're going to do is we're going to put it between the two layers. See, it sits there. And so look, there's the edge. So it's good to see the edge. That's what we want to know, that piece right there. You can trim away everything else later. But what we're going to do now is we're going to sew pad stitches across and through this little piece of muslin that we have installed. The object here is we don't want our collar points to wing up like donkey ears. And so this is a little reinforcement that you can do. So the first row secures the little piece of muslin between the layers. And then second row, we start the work. So now,
Does that stitch go through to the under?
yes,
fabric too?
it goes through all the layers. Yes.
Okay.
Each row of stitching, we're going to build a curl. We want this to tend to want to pull around. We're going to all the layers with the pad stitch, and the stitches are closer together. The rows are closer together. We want more control in this area.
Oh my God, that's genius.
And
Wait till you see it finish.
so one more row, and then continue off camera.
So you change direction on purpose?
Yes. You don't want to start the thread over. You just want to turn, go one down one and up the other. It's just a lot
For the
easier.
curl? Okay.
Yeah.
So you can see we're starting to build a roll in there. So I will just continue and keep rolling this. And I will bring it back when I'm finished.
I have a question.
Yes.
Would you use this application on most coat collars, or is
I
there a
would.
certain?
Yeah, I just think it's a, if you have any, especially something with kind of a long point to it,
Mhm.
it makes the point just really lay flat. So it doesn't curl forward. It wants to lay back against the body of the jacket or coat. So yeah, it's,
Okay. And so the entire building of the collar, you would tend to go with this entire technique.
for something
when
like this,
doing
yes.
coats.
There are other, like if you ever took the Craftsy Fly Front class, the tailoring is a little more freewheeling than this.
Mhm.
But for anything where I really, really want to control the collar and make a nice crisp collar, this is the way to go.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Okay. So
Okay. So you can see this is really what we want. We want that to pull backwards. From here, I will fill in the rest of the pad stitching and bring it back to show you the result. And here is the finished pad stitched collar. Now these ends we're going to press flat when we go to the pressing table. But before we go to the pressing table, we just want to trim off any excess muslin so it doesn't hang us up later. Now that that's done, we will take this over to the pressing table and press.
I guess any questions before we continue? Is everyone just enchanted and thrilled by this?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Okay.
It just changed my whole collar.
Well, that little thing, I learned that from an old tailor. I was like, yeah, that's pretty damn cool. So yeah, it just from then on, my collars looked so much better.
I mean, it was worth it just to watch someone pad stitch, because it's one of those things in your brain that never quite works the way you think it's going to work.
Well, also the thing, I realize that showing my finger looking all chewed up like that may not have been the prettiest thing, but for me, the pad stitching thing it's a tactile thing. It's something I can't really explain. It's
Yeah,
just
you
that
can't.
I've done it enough, and I just know how much that needle has to hit my finger to get the proper bite of fabric, and that's just something you just have to experience.
Okay.
And just on that in particular, I mean, obviously some fabrics are a lot more forgiving in terms of hiding anything that's sort of come down a little bit too far.
Yes.
Any other tips and tricks for fabrics that aren't that forgiving? Mine's not going to be that forgiving, I can tell already. So I'm feeling a bit on edge about that.
Well, okay, one thing, if you're worried about the pad stitching showing, that's considered a good thing by people who know these things. So if you're worried about the pad stitching, I guess, is that your question? Because, some of this stuff for the people, in my opinion, for the people who matter, when they see that and recognize it, they know what they're looking at. So it's not a bad thing if you do see the dimples in the fabric. Did that answer your question?
Yep, no, that's great. I was just hoping for some other magic answer. That's all.
Well, that's the magic answer. The people who matter will see that and know what you've done. And that's
Awesome.
the important thing. Okay. So.
And in terms of thread choice, and needle choice for that, do you think there's any advantage in using a lightweight silk thread like a YLI 100 and perhaps like a, super thin applique needle as opposed to a normal sewing crowbar?
Well, see, what you could do is, I would say make a test for the fabric. But as far as needles, I tend to prefer a milliner's needle. I like them because they're longer and you can get them in different sizes. So, the needle choice is kind of a personal thing, in my opinion. But yes, test it with like a Gutermann polyester, test it with the silk to see which one you like better, because you are the designer. You can make that call.
Thank you.
And another thing that I've seen, especially answering KJ's question about the magic, of hiding the stitching in the undercollar, is a contrast undercollar. What do you think of those?
Oh, I love that. I think that's great. Yeah. So, see, this is all up for, since you are the designer, you could choose to do that. Also, if you wanted to, you could choose to make the undercollar out of something a little thicker, like a Melton, that would absorb the stitching. So that's another option as well.
So I have a plaid Melton. Should I think about getting a solid Melton for the undercollar, like a solid black, or just let the
I would just use what you have.
Okay.
Because the plaid is going to hide the stitches more than a solid.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So other questions? Okay, then. So back to the pressing. First, we want to press the collar point. So you can see that will flatten out. And then you want to press that side and then come in. And press this side. So I will repeat on the other side. Press the point. Press that and the stand.
Kenneth,
Yes, there we are. So
can you please explain why you just pressed out your nice roll?
well, you want that to be flat when you construct.
Yeah, and then what you mean over time it's gonna remember and roll?
It will, it absolutely will. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and when you see the, at the end, when you actually see the collar constructed, you'll see it's almost imperceptible, but you will see that it curls slightly in, which is what you want. Okay. I also like to just give a little bit of stretch. If you stretched it too much to join it to the upper collar, no big deal. So here we have the undercollar. Next, we will join the undercollar with the upper collar. Here we have the upper collar,
And what I have done is I've cut 2 snips at the center back so that we can match that to the undercollar. And before we join the two, I'm going to just stretch this starting at center back. It's not going to stretch a lot. It will stretch more or less depending on your fabric. But what this does, you can see here, pull out a little bit. You can see this little bit of lift here. This is going to make the upper collar sit better on the neck. And since this is cut on the cross grain, you're going to get a little more stretch. So we will go now to the work table and join this to the undercollar. One thing you want to do before you join the undercollar to the upper collar is trim off any of this edge that may have found its way out, because you want the cut edge of the muslin to be your stitching guide. So there's not a lot here to trim, but it doesn't hurt to be accurate. Ready to join the two. Now I've worked ahead, matching the center back and matching the cut edges of the upper collar with the undercollar. Now you can put more or fewer pins in. I'm going to be using more pins. So then from here to here, what I'm looking at is I want to match first the corner and work backwards from the corner. So that's the corner there. Now I'm pin basting. You could, after you have it all pinned, you could hand baste it. That's entirely okay. Now you notice the upper collar is a little bit longer. That's a good thing. You just turn it like this and they will match, so that when you sew them together, you won't get a buckle on the undercollar. Also with the undercollar, it's on the bias, so it's going to conform to the upper collar.
Oh my God, I think this class just paid for itself.
Here we are. Matched to the corner. And then now I like to have these two edges match, because you want a little extra on the upper collar so it comes up and over and matches the curve. Don't pin them one to one. You see your collar is going to roll over like that. So you want the two layers. It's better to pin them in the contour that they will be living in the garment. It just makes for better sewing. Now what I will do is I'm going to do the little trick at the corners that I showed you to turn the corners. Now, if you remember the little trick I showed you turning the corners on the cuff latch, I'm doing this. Now, a little explanation is in order. I had planned to show the cuff latch first. What this is I take a loop of buttonhole thread and I catch the, as you can see, catch through the muslin and the fabric. And so then everything comes in between the layers. And so this little thing here is going to enable me to turn a really sharp corner. And you'll see a little more on that one next week when we do the cuff latch. So sorry that I'm kind of speaking in code now. So I thought I would stop and explain that before we continue. And here you can see I'm using black buttonhole thread, and I'm actually wanting to catch it through the muslin. because that is going to be a little stronger than catching it through the face fabric. So now that we're all set up and ready to go, let's go to the machine. And we're going to start out, you can see I'm using my zipper foot because I do love it. I'm going to start out with a standard 2.5 stitch. We're going to sew right next to that cut edge. Now, when we get to here, we're going to shorten the stitch to 0.75, and we're going to go just outside that little loop. And turn it 2 or 3 stitches. Turn again. So for another 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch at that stitch length, lengthen the stitch back. Continue on. And again, shorten the stitch, 0.75. Just outside the little thread loop. 2 or 3 stitches. Stitch for about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch. Lengthen the stitch back to the 2.5. So let me show you the result here. So you can see that little loop then remains intact, so you can trim really close. We'll trim that out, but let's do all of that at the pressing table. Our first step is to get rid of this little bit of seam allowance. You don't need it, it adds bulk. And see, aren't you glad you engaged in preliminary bulk reduction? From here, we're going to press as sewn. Now, I want to press the seam allowances open, so that will require the point presser. As we did on the cuff latch, it's much easier to press seam allowances open before you trim the corners. So I'm just, as you can see, I'm pressing the ends first. Then I will press this edge here. Here we are, pressed.
Next, trimming. So the trimming, we're going to cut right across there. And again, that's why you have those extremely short stitches. And then I'm going to trim a steep angle here and a steep angle here. From here, I will trim the undercollar seam allowances to 1/4 inch, or half of the 1/2 inch, just half the seam allowance. So we'll go a little ways here. So that's what our trimming will look like. I will continue on to the other end and bring back the results. Now that everything is trimmed, we can turn this right side out. So the first pass at this is going to be using the point turner. Try to get this turned as much as possible. And then here is the thread, the anchor thread. See, is that not a thing of beauty? I'll trim that off later. Now let me turn the other one. And there are many different ways to turn corners crisply. And I'm always looking for that one that works the best. And this seems to work pretty darn well. So yeah, so we turn this, and you're pushing really on the undercollar side because you've got more canvas, got more support. And then when you get it as far out as you can push it, then take it the rest of the way out with this. And you can use this to pull, to press, and then you trim it off later. So now that we're turned right side out, this is where we start to press. Now we're going to favor the edge to the undercollar. And so I'm going to get out the pressing ham. I just think it's going to be better. And the pressing cloth. So if you can't really see this, I don't want to mar this fabric because someone is actually going to be wearing this. So pressing cloth. And yes, pressing it over a ham because it is going to live on the body. It's not going to live on a flat surface. So I just like pressing curves over a ham when you absolutely want it to sit flat. There we are. So let me press this. I will come back and show you the results.
I have a question. What are the markings on your pressing cloth?
See, this pressing cloth does dual duty. I have a method of taking a pattern from an existing garment, and it involves using silk organza. So these marks are lengthwise and crosswise grains on the silk organza. So what I do is I use the disappearing, the pens that disappear with heat, so I can recycle a piece of silk organza. And so when I'm not using it to take a pattern from a garment, I'm using it as my pressing cloth. So
Okay.
yeah, I figured people would ask, or were like, what the hell is that? That's what that's for. Okay. 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 So there, our corner. I'll trim that off later. And you can see the seam favors to the back. That's as it should be. Favor that just a tiny bit. And so next, what I want to do is to baste around the collar edge. So this is our beloved tailor baste again. We want these edges to sit nice and flat. And you want to baste that curve in. So we're done with this. We can trim these off. And it's starting to look like a collar. Next, we want to build in the turn of cloth for the upper collar. So what I'm going to do here is smooth this out flat and fold and pin. Because we want to make sure that the fabric is snug up against each other. Now, what you're going to see here, that's not going to kill you. That's why I do this. We add a turn of cloth in that is actually added to the upper collar, but sometimes, depending on the thickness of the fabric, you're going to have a little mismatch. That's not going to kill you. So what I will do here, come in here and pin. Center back, match the center back. Once I pin that, I will go off camera and tailor baste that and bring it back here. Okay. We have these layers basted together. Now you can unpin these. So you built your turn of cloth in. Now it's going to want to sit nicely. So our next step will be going to the machine to do a machine baste at 1/2 inch to hold all of these layers together. This is just a machine baste at 1/2 inch.
So Kenneth, it's a 1/2 inch from whichever one is the lower.
That's correct. Yeah, because see, the upper collar, we lost a little width there. So I like to use the under collar as the guide.
Okay.
Okay.
Mhm.
Will be in the seam allowance. And now we will take this over to the pressing table and shape it on the ham to finish. As you can see, I have it so that seam allowance goes underneath the edge of the collar and it meets at the center front. And it really just needs a little steam.
I'm going to stop this for a moment. See, Vicky, see how that collar point and this collar point curl under?
Yes, it's a miracle. Yes.
Yeah. And so, so we may have appeared to press it out when we were pressing the under collar flat, but when it all constructs, that's the effect you want.
Excellent.
Okay. There you are. A thing of beauty. Now, one thing, see how that curves down? That's what you want. That will make it so that your points don't look like donkey ears. So there is the collar. Back to the work table. And here we have details. And we will have the cuff latches next time. We have the collar, which turned out quite nicely, if I may say so myself. And we have the cuff latches. Now, this is where we would have a discussion of top stitching, because up until now, we haven't really needed it. But I do think that we want to talk about it. There are different methods for top stitching. What I'm going to be choosing for this particular fabric will be a little different than what you might choose, because there is such a texture on this fabric. But our next topic is musings on top stitching. And that will be next week. So, are your brains full?
I'm not kidding when I say this lesson paid for the entire class.
Thank you. Yes. You know, actually, the first time I ran this class, one of the ladies, when we got done, she said, that was just beautiful to watch. You know, and I was like, well, thank you. That's, you know, because I just do it all the time. So for me, it's no big deal. But yeah, so that's, thank you. I'm glad you said that, Anne, because it, you know, it's just good to know these things.
Yeah. Oh, I'm mind blown.
And so next week we're going to do the cuff latch, and we're going to do the tutorial on top stitching, because there are different methods of top stitching I'm going to show, because, you know, there's not one method for every that goes in every situation. So that's going to be what we're going to be covering. And then we will do the intersecting seams, which is a little off topic, but it's just cool to know. So, and please, again, remind me so that I don't forget that one. So questions? Yes, Sonia.
I have a question. So the ideal would be to kind of follow do our work based on how you're teaching us.
Yeah.
So first cutting, and now we should do the collar before we start assembling.
Right. Mm-hmm. See, I like to make the different pieces, and as we go along, you know, we're going to have, there's a collar, then there's the cuff latch and the top stitching and intersecting seams. Then we're going to be doing preparing the single welt pockets. That's going to be one whole lesson. Then setting those single welt pockets in, because my particular method for setting the single welt pockets in works perfectly every time. And that's really why I use this particular method, because it never fails. And then there's the, you know, adding the sleeves, constructing the lining, all the different pieces. So I tend to like making all the components, and then it just seems to be very quick once all the components are together to put everything together. Okay, so other questions?
Thank you.
Well, I believe our work is done for today. I'm going to turn the recording off, but I'm going to hang around for a few more minutes.